Good morning, Tracy. Good morning, Emma. Good morning, Janice. We are back for Books at Lunchtime again. We had a little break because it's been very, very busy over the New Year period, but we love chatting with authors and talking about books in this session. So we're really, really pleased this morning to welcome Janice Hadlow to our little group. So good morning, Janice.
Good morning, Janice.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's so lovely to be with you.
Oh, good. Well, let's just jump straight in. So your book, we were just talking amongst ourselves a few moments ago. So your book came to our attention through one of our volunteers who's been recommending it to our people in our friends scheme, and it's called The Other Bennet Sister. Can you tell us about it, please?
Well, I've been reading Pride and Prejudice on and off since I was about 14. I actually have in my shelf over there the old paperback that was given to me for my birthday in 1975, I think. So I've been keen on this story for a very long time. And I must have read it once every year, probably during that time. But I think it was only probably a couple of years ago that I really began to notice this character on the edge of the action. Mary Bennett, the plain sister that nobody really loves. She hasn't got a huge role to play in the book. She's often there really as one of Austen's kind of comic grotesques. And she never says a word without everybody throwing up their hands in horror or kind of closing their eyes and just raising their eyes to heaven. She annoys everybody. Nobody really cares for her. And she's there, I think, sometimes to make you laugh. She's also there, I think, as a contrast to Lizzie. So both Lizzie is clever, but Mary is scholarly. And the two things produce a very different kind of woman. And you're not really supposed to feel very sorry for Mary. Austen clearly doesn't feel sorry for her. And she is pretty merciless towards Mary on every possible occasion. You're never allowed to feel any sympathy for her or to feel anything apart from, this is an odd, awkward woman, and she's there to make me smile occasionally. Well, there came a point after having felt that myself for quite a long time when I actually began to think, I wonder what it was like to be Mary. Because I think the truth is that all of us who really love Pride and Prejudice, we read it because of Lizzie, who's so, Austen calls her light, bright and sparkling. And we all want to be Lizzie. I think, she's probably the heroine that most of us in our dreams would like to be. But actually, the truth is, I suspect that a lot of us who love the book also know a bit more what it's like to be Mary, to not always say the right thing, to sometimes feel that you don't fit in, to feel that other people are smarter and cleverer and prettier than you are. And once this came into my mind, I began to think, what would the novel of Pride and Prejudice look like if we were to see it through Mary's eyes? And what might happen to Mary in a different world after the end of it? Austen's very clear that in her merciless way, we last see Mary with Mrs. Bennet for all eternity, which seems like quite a grim life to me. But I was keen to think, first of all, how did her experiences at Longbourn make her into the woman that we see in Pride and Prejudice? What might it look like from her eyes? And what might happen to her if she was allowed a different kind of future from the one that Austen allows her? So that's quite a long answer to, that's what my book is really. It sees Pride and Prejudice both bit before the action, during the action, through Mary's eyes, and then it imagines an alternative future for her, based on what I think we learn about her in the novel itself.
Emma, you've read this, haven't you?
I have, yes.
What was your response to it?
Oh, well, because I also have a very well-thumbed copy of Pride and Prejudice.
I know you've read that all.
And love it very much. I sort of approached this thinking, well, this is going to be an exciting adventure. And I really liked the fact that the first part of the book was looking at the story that we're so familiar with, but from Mary's point of view. And I suppose reading Pride and Prejudice, it never really resonated with me how put down she was all the time by her mother. That endlessly, you're not attractive, you'll never live up to your sisters. She was always the foil to these two older sisters, and the one that was dutifully going off and learning how to play the piano and trying to make an impression with her skills. But I really liked the way that you took it forward to consider what might have happened to her. And I was fascinated by the love triangle, essentially, the Thomas and the William, and how you dealt with that. And also the way that you used the Gardiner's family, again, in this story. In a
I love the Gardiner.
Yeah, I thought that.
I think the Gardiners.
Sorry, go on.
The Gardeners are such brilliant. Sorry, interrupting you. I think the Gardeners are such brilliant characters.
Yeah.
You know, when they're such a breath of kind of fresh air into what is often quite a tight atmosphere at Longbourn. You know, whenever any of the family go off and visit them, or Austen talks about the times when the Gardeners have visited the Bennets at Longbourn, you just get the impression of a great gust of, I don't know, less anxious, fresh air coming into this family. And every description you see of how also the Gardeners are probably, apart from until our heroine gets married, they're the best example of a happy marriage actually in the whole of Pride and Prejudice. You know, they obviously work as a partnership. They're lively, love each other. They've got this extraordinary big happy family, and I think although they're not in it very often, that left quite a strong impression with me, and I just wanted to be with them a bit longer, see what their world in London looked like from Mary's perspective.
Yeah, I thought that was very clever. And also Jane gets sent to the Gardeners in Pride and Prejudice to recover from Mr. Bingley not proposing, and you've got Mary going to stay with them and learning that this is what a family can be like. I thought that was I loved it. I really enjoyed the book.
Oh, well, thank you. Oh, well, I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, that was precisely what I wanted Mary to learn from the Gardeners, that actually this is what a family life can be like. This is what it's like when you have the tone for the family set by a loving husband and wife. Because I think it's always struck me that actually, I know some people find the badinage between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet quite funny. And at one level it is, but it's also, there's also a lot of repressed rage there, I think, especially with Mr. Bennet. You know, he's clearly a very frustrated and quite unhappy man, married to a woman that he can't respect. There's that amazing moment when Lizzie goes to him and says she wants to marry Mr. Darcy, and he says he can't believe it. He just can't believe that she really wants this. And he says the most feeling lines that he says in the whole of the novel, which is, you know, let me not see you know what it is to be married to a partner you can't respect. And it's the most heartfelt thing that Mr. Bennet says, and I think is at the root of a lot of the unhappiness in the Bennet family. So a lot of the things that Mr. Bennet says as jokes actually are quite, I think, a sign of an unhappy man rather than a joyful man. And the Gardeners seem to me to be a contrast to that unhappiness, because the happy family that the Gardeners create happens because they have a loving marriage, which I'm afraid I don't think at all the Bennets do.
No. Excellent.
I think what interests me particularly about the way you've approached this subject, Janice, is the idea of just putting the beauty back into that kind of realism. So, like, as you said at the beginning, which I think is just so on point, that most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, are more Mary than Lizzie. And also, I mean, what you see about the Gardeners being the kind of family dynamic we maybe aspire to have, and yet it's not celebrated in those terms in Pride and Prejudice. And I wonder if you think that those sensibilities have changed over the time when Austen was writing to now, to the point that we need that reinterpretation of Mary and her importance, and we need to be able to see the Gardeners for the kind of dynamic that they have.
Well, I think that is in a way two interesting questions. So
yeah.
Let me answer the one first of all about the family. I mean, before I wrote this book, I've written a big factual book about 18th century history, which is based on the family life of George III, and that involved me spending a lot of time thinking about what family means in the 18th and early 19th century. And there's no doubt at all that it becomes steadily more important. The idea of a family that is Austen herself probably wouldn't have used the word happy. I think she might have said affectionate, or there were other terms that she might have used to describe what a happy family looked like and felt like. but it becomes an increasingly important part of life during the 18th century. So that's not to say there were no happy families before, but in culture, in print, in books and magazines, even the way that people are painted, the idea that, you know, there is this domestic happiness to which everybody, they don't go so far as to say we're entitled, but it's something that we all want to try and aspire to. So I think that certainly she would understand our view of what we think a happy family looks and feels like, because that was something that her contemporaries spent an awful lot of time thinking about and working and trying to imagine what that could be. To the greater, even more, because of course she knew that that was set by the partnership that you chose to make. And in her period, the only thing that was going to dissolve that basically was death. So one of the reasons why it's so important that you choose the right partner in life, as Mr. Bennett says to Lizzie, is that, you know, you are going to be with them until one of you dies. And there are no second chances in that choice in Austen land, apart from that one, which is supplied by death. So it really, really mattered who you married, because that decision was final. And then I think the second question so that feels to me a kind of modern idea that we can all identify with. What does a happy family look like? And what does an unhappy family do to those people who live within it? Because I think in the end, Mary is very damaged by her family life. Neither Jane nor Lizzie are, because Lizzie's too strong a character. Mrs. Bennet finds her annoying and irritating, but Lizzie is also, actually, as Austen tells us, very handsome. So to some extent, although Mrs. Bennet finds Lizzie difficult to control, she's nevertheless, she's ticked most of the boxes that Mrs. Bennet wants from one of her daughters. All the others are pretty. Kitty is a bit of a mystery. We don't learn much about Kitty, apart from the fact that she follows very avidly in Lydia's footsteps, and Lydia is not going to be put down by anybody. So, as quite often happens in a family dynamic, there's one person who seems to be at the butt of everybody's difficulties, and in that case, it's Mary. So that's, I think, something that equally, perhaps we've got experience of either in our own families or having seen it elsewhere. I think the second question, though, I think your question about what makes us respond to this now, is what I tried to think. My version of what happens to Mary, which is that she learns the most important lesson, both to us as modern people, but one I think that meant a huge amount to Austen too. She learns to know who she really is. And it seems to me that every single Austen heroine has to go on a journey of self-discovery. All those women that we love so much from those books, they start thinking one thing about themselves and they end up thinking another. So with Elizabeth Bennet, she at the beginning, her sin, if you like, is pride. You know, she thinks that she knows better than other people. She thinks that she can make instant judgments. She thinks that, you know, her opinion once given is never to be revised. This is Lizzie's issue, if you like. And she has to go on a journey to understand that actually her pride is different from Mr. Darcy's, but they're both proud in their own way, and they have to find a way to come together. And it's so often that that's the case with an Austen heroine. They go on a self-knowledge journey. It's only when Lizzie really knows herself that she's ready to accept Mr. Darcy as the right partner in life. And the same thing's true for Anne Elliot in Persuasion. You know, she has to learn courage. She has to learn to actually value her own decisions and actually choose Captain Wentworth. And only when she's stopped being the person that we meet at the beginning of the novel can she be happy. That's true for almost everybody, I think. All those great heroines we love, they all go on that journey. And I wanted to put Mary on the same journey. So I wanted to take this woman who we meet, who has one idea of herself and what she's worth and what she thinks and how she feels about herself, and take her on a journey that is both one that we recognise ourselves as modern people, but is one I think also that Austen would have appreciated, because it's what she does with all her heroines, to allow them to become the person that they really should have been, to gain some self-respect, to gain some self-knowledge. And only when they've done that can they really be trusted to themselves to make a decision on who's right for them in the world. So in a way, for me, that's why I think they're such great novels about women, is because that's the real journey. That's the really interesting thing. That's what Austen is really interested in. Who are you going to become before you're in the position to know which man is right for you? You know, How long does it take Lizzie to realise that Wickham is a cat? How long does it take Anne Elliot to realise that she just should have said yes to Captain Wentworth and told everybody else, that she'd made this decision? All these Austen women have to do this. And Mary, I felt, had to go on a very different journey, which was to recover that, not to throw off the vision of herself that had been constructed for her in Longbourn, and discover who she might really be. And only when she's done that is she going to be able to be capable of looking around and saying, if I'm lucky enough to come across love, how will I make my choice?
Isn't that fascinating? And this is also generated another question for you as well, Janice. I mean, you mentioned that you started reading Pride and Prejudice when you were a teenager. You said the same, Emma. Yeah. That was the same for me. I remember read it when I was, I don't know, 13 or something. And I wanted to read it because it was that sort of pseudo-intellectualism thing that I thought it would be smart. Yeah. And I loved it. And then I read it again when I was sort of A-levels and loved it, and so on and so forth. But I wonder if this was a novel that you could only have written coming from it slightly later in life. Because I feel with Pride and Prejudice that, like so many of those classics, you get different things out of it at different life stages.
I think that is so true. I mean, absolutely, entirely true. And, I think Pride and Prejudice is a great novel for it's a great novel to read when you're a young woman, especially if you're quite a sort of bookish young woman, because what you get with Lizzie is she's so clever. Anyone who thinks of themselves as a bit bookish and perhaps, not a bit up that end of thinking, it's so delightful to see this clever heroine who's never lost for words, who is never crushed by the people around her. Her intellect is so outward directed, if you know what I mean. She's such a brilliant heroine for the kind of girl who perhaps does read that feeling a little bit out of it, a little bit awkward. That's certainly what I felt when I read it. So as a young woman, it's just brilliant. And the idea that, you in the end will win over this reluctant alpha male who, at the end of it is who simply can't help himself. He's so entranced by your charm and your wit and your sassiness. I mean, that's a brilliant, brilliant combination. But I think you're absolutely right to say that when you read it later in life, you see different things in it. I think that's true for other Austen novels as well. I mean, personally, I think Persuasion, for example, is very much a novel that you get a huge amount more out of when you're just that bit older. When you understand what resignation might feel like more than when you're in your early 20s, when you have a sense of what it's like to feel that things are closed down and over. I know for us, the idea that this is being felt by Anne Elliot, who's still in her middle to late 20s, seems extraordinary. But, those are feelings that I think a lot of people encounter only perhaps when they've had more experience of life, and they know that, love affairs often don't end how you want them to do, and that you will have to learn to deal with unhappiness that you can't always change. And those things feel to me like things that are very, very particular. You'll get a completely different reading from Persuasion as an older person than you do when you first read it. And I think that's true for Pride and Prejudice too. That's why I think I started noticing this character, because of Mary, because to some extent you start to feel a bit more widely to people who aren't always successful. Your vision expands a bit to take in all these characters that Jane Austen does so brilliantly, and start thinking a bit more empathically about what does life look like if you're that person. I mean, I even felt that a bit about Mr. Collins, who's the greatest villain in all Austen writing, this pompous, ridiculous man. And yet the great thing that Austen does is she always gives you a little clue about why these people that she creates are like they are. It's almost as though every character has behind them the potential of their own life story being brought to existence. So there's one line, I might just find it, that struck me about Mary, that she says about Mary, in consequence of being the only plain one in the family, worked hard for knowledge and accomplishments, and is always impatient for display. And I mean, that's just such a sad picture of a life. You know, if you notice, once you start to notice that, you think, I know who this woman is now. You know, she can't, no one ever notices her because she doesn't look right. And she's just desperate to find some way to distinguish herself and to win affection. I may not be beautiful, but look how I can play the piano. And isn't it interesting that the ultimate humiliation that she's dealt out by the hands of her father involves her being told to stop playing the piano? She's not even allowed to have that as a success. And I think that, you know, that Austen gives you, for example, there's one little paragraph where she tells you about Mr. Collins's past. And once you've read that, you don't even notice it probably the first 10 times you read it. But when you have read it, you start thinking, this is a real person. You know, what has turned him into being this ludicrous figure? And Austen's such a genius that even at the same time as she's being kind of offering you this amazingly unsympathetic portrait, she still leaves you that little seed of, he's had a tough life though, isn't he? and that is why I think you're completely right. You learn, you come to Austen novels quite differently depending on your stage of life. And I think one of the things that happen when you know the plot, when you're no longer waiting to find out is how is Darcy and Elizabeth, how is this going to be managed? When you know it and you're so familiar with it, it's like when you're in a house. I mean, this rented house I'm living in, you know, I've been here a month. First of all, I just noticed the big things about it, but increasingly I notice all the little things around the edge. And I think that's what happens when you read Austen with a different level of maturity and a greater level of familiarity. She's such a brilliant writer that you keep seeing all these bits of stuff that you've never noticed before. And they're all so brilliantly placed. Even these minor characters have the ability, you feel, to come out and say, look at me, think about me. And I found that tremendously exciting. And I think that, you know, some of those characters have the capacity to be as modern in their experiences and the empathy we feel for them as some of her great heroines.
Well, if that hasn't inspired people to pick up a copy, I don't know what will. Tracy, can you tell us, we have them in stock at the moment in the shop?
Yes, we do have copies in stock in the shop. Yes. I was going to ask if you'd had any resistance from any die-hard Austen fans, but it sounds like you were just so faithful to the story and really took the opportunity to develop the character on Austen's own terms that I can't imagine anyone could have objected. How was it received?
Well, I've been, you know, I mean, I think there are 1,100 reviews on Amazon now. And at the moment it's got 4.6 stars. So I'm assuming, you know, that it's very difficult to read reviews. So, you know, I sometimes think it's best to keep a little bit of distance from that, because you know you're never going to please everybody. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if there were Austen lovers who, for example, think, you know, that disagree with the way that I've shown Mrs. Bennett. But I think the truth is that whenever you make a decision to tell a story from another character's perspective, the characters around that person are going to shift and change. You know, it's just going to look a bit different. You're looking at it from the other end of a telescope. I think with a great work of art like Pride and Prejudice is, I think everybody is entitled in a way to have a view. I don't think there's one right view. I think there's not one correct perspective. I think there are as many perspectives as there possibly can be. I felt for myself that I wanted to create a story for Mary that Austen would have recognised, that I built on the characteristics that I thought I saw Austen allow her in the book. And then, yes, I did take the authorial decision that I would take some of those characteristics and run with them in a way that I thought were possible. I also tried very hard to create for Mary an outcome that wasn't impossible in her time and her place. I didn't want to make her into a genius. I didn't want her to turn out to be Jane Austen, you know, writing in secret, because I don't think Mary is a genius. I think she's an ordinary woman who's found herself in a difficult place. And I think if you want to write about a genius like Austen, that's a completely different challenge. So I didn't turn Mary into, you know, I didn't make her into a best-selling author. I tried to be true to what I thought a happy ending for a woman like Mary might look like in, say, 1810, which is where I have it in my mind, sort of where that is located. And I did feel that for her, it did mean getting out the country. I think she had to go. I think I was very keen that she should go and experience London. And I did look at a lot of the letters that Austen herself wrote when she was in London towards the end of her life, visiting John Murray, her publishers. One of her brothers lived in London, and she writes some great, fascinating. She clearly had a really nice time there, and there was a lot about London that she enjoyed. And I tried to use some of the things that she said about her experience and put them into Mary's, so that I felt that that would try and keep Mary's development as close as I could to something that, if it hadn't been what Austen would have chosen for her, at least she would have recognised it.
Well, it certainly has made our readers very happy. So we're very grateful that you were so meticulous with.
I mean, such a lot to hear that.
No, it really has, and we look forward to what you are writing next. But in the meantime, because I know that books of this quality do take time to produce, what would you recommend that your readers should have a look at, having enjoyed your book?
Well, you suggested I might try and think of a couple of titles, and I think I've got some fiction and some factual ones. Some of these would be very familiar, I'm sure, to lovers of Austen, but myself, I'm a huge fan of Barbara Pym. I think she has a sort of Austenish flavour sometimes. She writes amazing books about people with slightly ordinary lives in small places, but who are often experience under the surface of their lives lots of very big emotions. And my favourite of her books is A Glass of Blessings, written in the late 1950s, but if you pick it up now, it feels both an extraordinary period book in a way, but also very modern. Got an amazing theme. I really recommend that. During lockdown, if you want something again with a kind of very merciless, I used that word before about Austen, but a kind of merciless but very funny tone to it. Nancy Mitford's The Pursuit of Love. I'd really definitely recommend that one. Just such fun. And if you finish that and you want to read another, then Love in a Cold Climate, equally recommend that. Anything by Colette, I would say. I mean, my own favourites are her non-fiction thing. She wrote a series of non-fiction, I don't know what you call them really, essays. They used to be published in Penguin. My old Penguin copies are very battered, but My Apprenticeships, The Pure and the Impure, any of those, and My Mother's House. These are absolutely sublime stories, of all of them really about what it is to be a woman and a woman's heart, if you like. I don't know how easy those are to get now, but if you can't get those, her short stories, collected short stories, are just fantastic. Published, I think, still you can get those. And the two Cherie novels, Cherie and The Last of Cherie, they're the things to buy new. But if you really love it, I would hunt down the other ones because they are sublime. And then there are two fiction, non-fiction books. If you're interested in Austen's world and the kind of real lives that were lived in it during that time, I can't recommend more highly. Brilliant book of history, Amanda Vickery, The Gentleman's Daughter. Very, very, very highly regarded social historian who's written the most brilliant book about the lives of what she calls, and what Austen would have called, genteel women, mostly in Yorkshire actually, so not down in Austen's Hertfordshire, but they are heartrending, extraordinary, and when you read them, it's not like reading, I mean, if I say it's not like reading a scholarly book, although it is scholarly, it's just the most pleasurable and informative book to read. I'd really recommend that highly. If somebody wants to buy you a big, beautiful, expensive book for Valentine's Day and you love this period, Hilary Davidson's Dress in the Age of Jane Austen. Oh, what a treat. Big, sumptuous, fantastic illustrations of dresses and fabric, and if you like that, if you will drool if you can get it. And probably a bit presumptuous to say it, but if you found these, if you're interested in the inner lives of women in this period, my own book, The Strangest Family, which is the story of George III and his female family, the story of, when we were talking early on about ideas about family, ideas about what it was to have a happy family, and the extent to which George and his wife Charlotte attempt to try and create within the formal world of royalty the kind of affectionate family life that they thought people like the Austens were enjoying is the heart of that story. And it's full of great female stories, and most of them told in their own words. So any of those, I think, would perhaps be great lockdown companions for however long it goes on.
Those are some great suggestions, and as you say, some of them are out of print, but I think it's going to inspire people to go and spend many a long afternoon mooching around secondhand shops, and once we can all get out, it will give them something to hunt for. You've got one though, haven't you, Emma?
I have. I've got this one.
Yes, well, that is another. That is the probably the greatest biography in recent years, I think. Ever. I mean, I've read it over and over again, and you never tire of it. It's an extraordinary picture of a singular character. Again, full of amazing detail about the world and the life, and just can't really be bettered. So I should have mentioned that one too. I think I did actually have it on my list, and it is a fantastic book to read.
Yes, I had a look at your list, and Emma said, "You'll never believe this." So, well, this has been absolutely fascinating. We first met you at a dinner, and
yes,
in Aldborough, and you and Emma shared a table together, and here we are catching up over computer technology. So we'll look forward to getting around a table and having a proper drink and a chat and a meal one day. And you're just down the road in Suffolk. You're our neighbour, so we'll look forward to seeing you just as soon as we can.
How lovely that would be fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
It's been great speaking to you. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Bye. Bye.